Great.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to GCMY for inviting us to this event. My name is Joseph Gualtieri, and I'm a Corporate Engagement Officer on CDP's supply chain team for Southeast Asia. And over the next hour or so, my colleague Amelie and I will go over the supply chain program and review some of the opportunities available to vendors serving global supply chains. So I'll begin by introducing you briefly to CDP, and I will walk you through the supply chain program. And then I will hand it over to my colleague Amelie Tan, who will talk about how SMEs can set ambitious science-based emissions reductions targets. So I'll just go ahead to my slides now, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So some of you may not be familiar with CDP, so I will just go ahead and give a brief overview of who we are and the role we play in the sustainability ecosystem. So CDP is a mission-driven nonprofit organization that runs the world's largest corporate environmental disclosure platform. And our mission is to connect stakeholders with high-quality, decision-useful corporate environmental data. Each year, thousands of companies use CDP's disclosure system to measure and report their environmental impact. And since CDP began collecting environmental data in 2010, we have developed the world's largest comprehensive data set on corporate environmental action. And we use the data reported by companies to provide stakeholders with the insights they need to make environmentally informed decisions. And in the context of our supply chain program, this means providing members with the information they need to better understand the emissions embedded in their value chains. This allows members to use the data gathered through the CDP disclosure process to raise ambition and drive corporate environmental action throughout their value chains. So CDP has a broad network of stakeholders. We request information on behalf of our two authority groups, which are our investor signatories and our supply chain members. And using the authority of these stakeholders, we request target companies to provide environmental information, which we then provide to our stakeholders in a standardized comparable format. So just this year, in the disclosure cycle that wrapped up a few months ago, we processed environmental disclosures from just over 10,000 entities, including more than 9,600 companies and nearly 1,000 local governments, which reported through our cities, states, and regions program. So if you receive a request for information through CDP's supply chain program, this means that one or more of your customers has specifically requested environmental data from you. And when you respond, only the requesting company can access the data you provide in your response. Requested vendors use CDP's questionnaire and training materials to provide their customers with a profile of their environmental footprint. And as I said, supply chain members can then use this data to better understand the risks and opportunities embedded within their supply chains, to better engage with their vendors, and to inform their procurement decisions. And with respect to climate change, the program also allows members to measure and manage their Scope 3 emissions profile, which, as you may know, is an important element of both TCFD reporting and setting science-based targets, which my colleague Amelie will talk more about in just a moment. Similarly, as vendors, you can use the experience of reporting through CDP to understand the environmental risks and opportunities within your own operations and value chains. And again, this positions suppliers to better manage their own environmental footprints. So CDP gathers environmental data through the three questionnaires listed here: so climate change, water security, and forests. Members can ask their suppliers to provide information across one, two, or all three of these themes, as appropriate for their supply chain. Each theme has a separate questionnaire, although they are all designed to generate data around the core pillars of the vendor's environmental governance, strategy, targets, and risks and opportunities. The climate change questionnaire focuses on the company's plan to transition to a low-carbon economy and asks about emissions, targets, and energy use, among the other modules listed here. The water questionnaire allows companies to report water accounting data and the current state of water stewardship, as well as facility-level breakdowns on water usage. The forest questionnaire looks at the company's plans to remove deforestation from operations and supply chains, covering 5 key commodities. These are timber, palm oil, cattle production, soy, and rubber. If you receive a forest questionnaire, you'll be asked to report only on the commodity or commodities relevant to your business. The bulk of the questionnaire asks for company-wide data relevant to the 3 themes. You will also be asked to provide data specific to your relationship with your customers. So for example, in the climate change questionnaire, you are asked to allocate a share of your overall emissions to the goods and services provided to the requesting customer. And again, this information is visible only to your customers, and it really does help customers understand the impact of their business relationship with you. So as we can see from these charts, since 2010, the number of responding companies has grown substantially, with over 9,600 unique companies completing at least one questionnaire in 2020. And this is up from 8,400, more than 8,400 rather, in companies in 2019, representing a growth of about 14%. And so while CDP's climate change questionnaire has the greatest number of responding companies, the rapid growth of our other questionnaires on deforestation and water security indicates that investors and purchasing organizations have begun to take a broader view of environmental stewardship and to take into consideration a range of environmental factors when making investment or procurement decisions. So here we can see the distribution of companies responding to CDP in 2019. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a geographical breakdown of the 9,600 companies that responded in 2020. But you'll notice that the darker areas of the map indicate territories with responding companies. And as you can see, most countries or territories are home to responding companies. So what we found was that there was a roughly equal number of responding companies in Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America, with a smaller set of companies responding from South America and Africa. In particular, Malaysian companies represented just shy of the 143 Southeast Asian companies that responded to CDP. And so along with the chart on the previous slide, with this map we can identify a few trends. So the first is that companies worldwide are increasingly concerned about the environmental impact on their value chains. And another trend is that environmental reporting to customers and other stakeholders is quickly becoming the norm. And as we can see on this map, wherever your customers, your peer companies, or your own vendors may be, there's a good chance that at least some of them will have responded to CDP before. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what CDP does and the scale of the companies that we're working with. And so I'd like now to just zoom in for a moment on our supply chain program, which is how suppliers and SMEs are most likely to encounter CDP. So in CDP's program, our 150 plus members request information from their suppliers who complete the CDP questionnaires discussed previously via our online disclosure platform. CDP then provides the data and insights back to the member. And this process helps the customers to identify key suppliers, to measure the environmental impacts of their supply chain, and to assess risks embedded within their supply chains. On the other hand, for suppliers, the CDP disclosure process means disclosing relevant information to members, as well as improving their own environmental performance and engaging with their own supply chains. So one reason why companies are increasingly focused on their supply chain emissions is because, as many of you likely know, Scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions embedded in a company's value chain, will be the major emissions type for most companies, amounting on average to 5.5 times the significance of direct emissions. And this gap is especially large in the case of companies in sectors like retail, hospitality, and manufacturing. But even for companies toward the bottom of this list, apparel, materials, power generation, and so on, indirect emissions still comprise an enormous share of a company's overall emissions profile. And so what a lot of companies find is that Scope 3 management presents an opportunity for companies with large supply chains to have an outsized effect on emissions beyond their direct operation. And as such, companies from all sectors have come to the conclusion that supplier engagement and management of emissions embedded in the supply chain really do have a key role in achieving wide-scale decarbonization. So on that note, we have here a graphic indicating just what this wide-scale change can look like in practice. So along the top of the screen here, you'll see some of the retailers that use CDP's supply chain program to engage with their suppliers. And retail was at the heart of the CDP's supply chain program. So as a matter of fact, CDP's program began just over a decade ago when Walmart approached CDP about using our platform to engage with suppliers as a part of their Gigaton project. And the program has grown from there. So members in the retail sector typically begin by focusing on their key tier 1 suppliers, which are often vendors producing consumer goods. These vendors then get accustomed to CDP's environmental disclosure and come to value the insights that it can offer. And so these tier 1 suppliers then use the program to engage with their own supply chains. So in the case of consumer goods companies, this means engagement among suppliers providing logistics and manufacturing. And the cycle continues as these suppliers then engage their own suppliers. And so in this manner, we can see the effect of supply chain engagement cascading throughout the sectors and across geographies. So I've made this chart to indicate the cascading effects with respect to retail specifically, but we really do see the same pattern of change emerge across other sectors as well. So given the cascading effect, you can imagine how our program would grow to its current size of over 150 members representing some 4 trillion in annual procurement spending, collectively engaging over 15,000 suppliers globally. And you will notice that companies from all sectors, from financial services companies like Bank of America and Barclays, and manufacturers like Toyota and Philips, to ICT companies like Western Digital and Telstra are all present. And the presence of so many leading companies in the program really does suggest that robust disclosure is becoming the norm both among globally competitive firms and their supply chains. So here we have a case study of how Dell uses the program. And so of course, each of the members listed in the previous slide will have its own unique strategy, opportunities, and challenges, and each will use the data gathered through CDP's supply chain program in its own way. In the case of Dell, vendors are evaluated on the criteria seen here, including disclosure of emissions, setting public goals, and preparing sustainability reports. And in an example of the cascade effect, Dell requires its suppliers to engage with their own suppliers. Similarly, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise uses a supply chain program in concert with its science-based target, and as an engagement tool to get a critical mass of vendors to set their own science-based targets. Like Dell, HPE ties CDP performance to vendor evaluation and procurement decisions. And as the quote indicates, HPE sees sustainability as a driver for improved environmental performance, both for its own benefit and, significantly, for the benefit of its suppliers. So as we mentioned, the CDP supply chain program will fit into each company's specific goals and targets in its own way. But whatever the background of the company requesting the information, what we find is that the aggregate outcome of these efforts is significant. So in 2019, our members reported a reduction of 633 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, which translates to a savings of just over $19.3 billion US. And the reduction in emissions was equivalent to 1% of all global emissions, or roughly equivalent to 120% of Australia's total emissions in 2019. And these savings, both in terms of cost and in terms of emissions cuts, really do reflect both the commercial benefits of supply chain engagement, as well as the importance of vendor engagement toward meeting global emissions reductions goals. So I hope that gives you a sense of what motivates companies to use CDP's supply chain program and why they may use the program to request data from vendors like your company. And in the last few minutes, before I hand it over to Emily to talk about science-based targets, I'd like to talk briefly about the supply chain program, but more from a supplier's perspective. The program's key benefits to members, that is to say, measuring and managing environmental impact, identifying cost savings, as well as risks and opportunities, improving governance and strategy, all of these benefits accrue to vendors as well as to members. So suppliers themselves can use the data gathered in the CDP reporting process to better understand their own environmental performance and to make improvements as necessary. We've also designed the program to lower the reporting burden on vendors. So CDP's disclosure system allows vendors to complete a single report and submit it to all stakeholders. So if, for example, you receive a CDP request from one customer or multiple customers and investors, you need to complete only one response and it will be disseminated to all. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, CDP's climate change questionnaire is aligned with the recommendations of the TCFD, and so vendors can use their CDP response as the basis of their own TCFD reporting. And importantly, there's no fee for suppliers to submit their data to these members or customers rather requesting through the CDP supply chain program. And so another benefit is that the program provides an opportunity for suppliers to propose collaborative opportunities. It also provides an opportunity to demonstrate the vendor's commitment to transparency. And finally, and perhaps less tangibly, we do encourage vendors to view the CDP supply chain program as an opportunity to engage with your customers and to show them that you as a supplier are committed to a long-term relationship. So if the customer requests environmental data from you, this is an indication that the customer sees you as a key vendor and would like to make sure you have a role in the customer's decarbonized supply chain. So the CDP reporting process really is an opportunity to acknowledge your customers' goals and to demonstrate your commitment to servicing them. So our members recognize that vendors engaged through the program may be at different stages in their journey towards environmental best practices, and vendors may require different levels of support, and the program is designed to support vendors at all stages. So we usually break the program into 3 phases, and in phase 1 of the program, members will support vendors with little experience in sustainability reporting to help them begin to calculate and report their emissions via the CDP platform. And then, having begun measuring their emissions, in phase 2, vendors can show CDP and supply chain members that they have the capacity to set ambitious climate targets and to report other activities and initiatives which are designed to drive down emissions. And then finally, in the 3rd phase, vendors can further improve their performance and show leadership by registering a reduction in emissions and adopting best practices in the transition to a low carbon economy. And with vendors at this stage, we see them beginning to, as I mentioned, engage with their own supply chains or set science-based targets of their own. So whichever phase suppliers may find themselves in when they are first requested to provide information through CDP, what we have found is that vendors can show improvement while reporting to customers. So even if you are, for example, in the majority of vendors who do not have an emissions reduction initiative in place, you can use the disclosure process to begin establishing initiatives and keep your customers updated on the progress. Similarly, if you're among the 50% of companies that have not yet set company-wide targets and goals when first requested for information, completing your CDP questionnaire can signal your dedication to doing so in the future. And this is especially important for SMEs that may be just establishing their sustainability practices or may be new to environmental reporting. So vendors really can use their CDP reports to both gather the necessary data in order to improve environmental action and again to signal their commitment to their customers. And so to that end, we offer a suite of materials to help vendors complete their CDP questionnaires. So each vendor receives a letter grade, which assesses their performance in each of the questionnaires they're asked to complete. Vendors can also reach out either to CDP or to our scoring partners for further insight into their performance. And we also provide capacity building webinars on everything from how to access and complete the questionnaires on our website to how to calculate your emissions and how to assess vulnerability to forest and water related risks. And throughout the disclosure cycle, which generally runs from April to July, we offer workshops, and in conjunction with our supply chain members, the requesting customers, we offer capacity building webinars in which members and CDP staff introduce the program, highlight key modules in the questionnaire, and answer vendor questions. So really, wherever you are in your sustainability journey, I would encourage you to respond to a CDP information request should you receive them. And if you're looking for a way to better engage with your own supply chain, please do feel free to get in touch. We'd be happy to tell you more about the program. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Emily, who will speak to you about setting science-based targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and hello, everyone, for having me. I'd like to, and hello from Hong Kong, where we are based. So my name is Amelie, and I am a project officer with the corporate engagement team here at CDP. And I engage with companies in Hong Kong, Macau, as well as Southeast Asia. And I'm very happy to be here to share with you about science-based targets. And we recently have a new route for SMEs. And now I'd like to go to my slides. All right. So a bit of background about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. The SBTI is a partnership of between CDP, UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF, and now counts over 1,000 companies with a commitment to set or already have approved science-based targets, emission reduction targets. Out of these companies, we are already seeing more and more of them having the targets approved. As of today, we have over 510 companies that are considered science-based and having the targets approved. So in Asia Pacific, we saw a huge increase in the number of companies who have committed as well as have their targets validated. In total, 264 companies as of October this year have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And approximately half, in Malaysia, Sarawak Energy committed to setting a science-based target in July, and Taiwan Garment Industry, a textile company, has an approved target as of August this year as well. Some of you may not be familiar with what science-based targets are, so I'm going to go through quickly with you. So science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are consistent with the level of decarbonization that is required to keep global temperature increase within 1.2 to 2 degrees Celsius. And the SBTs are a key tool for companies to prepare for and accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. Climate science tells us loud and clear that in order to reach the Paris objectives, the global economy needs to fully decarbonize by 2050 at the latest. So the long-term goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 acts as the North Star for strategic decision-making, while setting SBTs, short to medium timeframe targets for the next 5 to 15 years, ensures that companies are reducing direct as well as indirect emissions at the pace needed to achieve this long-term goal. At the same time, it produces a robust framework, aligns you with best practice, and incentivizes short to medium-term reductions. And along this journey, we are seeing disclosing on your emissions and strategies on an annual basis as a key component to ensure transparency and accountability and send a clear message to your stakeholders that you are on track to meet your targets. Now let's take a closer look at the elements of a science-based target. It always starts with the question of how much can you still emit, which is defined by the IPCC carbon budgets and related climate scenarios. These two in the left bucket on your slide, on this slide, are the scenarios that we are currently basing our reduction pathways on. So starting from the global carbon budget, we need to ask ourselves like how this budget is allocated among individual companies and across different sectors. This allocation is done based on the SDT methods, the absolute-based approach, and sector-based approach. The third element is defined by the combination of your company's specific characteristics, example, where your emissions and how much you will grow, all of which will influence your individual science-based target. And let's take a look at the differences between the two target methodologies I just mentioned. On the left here, we have the absolute-based approach or absolute contraction method, which is a linear absolute reduction where all companies reduce emissions at the same linear annual absolute reduction rate based on the level of ambition. And we can expect an annual emissions reduction of 2.5% for the well below 2 degrees pathway and a 4.2% for 1.5 degrees alignment. On the right, you can see the sector-based approach, which is based on sector-specific International Energy Agency or IEA pathways that take into consideration historical developments as well as future projections for a certain sector that define an intensity path that all companies will be converging on. So for the criteria, all targets need to be aligned with the SBTi criteria version 4.1 published in April 2020. And the most important criteria are, in terms of boundary, targets must cover company-wide scope 1 and 2 emissions and cover all relevant greenhouse gases at with a maximum of 5% that can be excluded from your target. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from your own or controlled sources, or while scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. And the time frame for targets must cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15 years from the date the target is submitted. Reporting wise, you must disclose GHG emissions inventory and your progress against the target on an annual basis. And the obvious choice would be to do that via CDP, but you can also report that via your sustainability report. At a minimum, your ambition must be consistent with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and targets must be forward-looking. So the screening of scope 3 emissions is defined as the purchased goods and services and the use of goods sold, use of sold products that's required. And if it covers more than 40% of overall emissions, a target for scope 3 covering 2/3 of emissions is required. This means that more companies need to measure their suppliers' emissions in order to report it against the targets each year. So when it comes to scope 3, the SBTi recognizes that scope 3 still presents a big challenge for companies, and given the scientific complexity, scope 3 targets are not considered science-based but need to be aligned with best practice. Company scope 3 targets must only cover 2/3 of emissions, 2/3 of scope 3 emissions, as I mentioned earlier. And the scope 3 targets can be framed as absolute targets, emissions intensity target, or supplier engagement target. Companies may also wish to set other types of targets, but should only do so if the targets can be translated into such absolute intensity or engagement targets. In a supplier engagement or customer engagement target, a company commits to drive the adoption of science-based targets amongst its suppliers or customers. Such targets may be particularly valuable if a company has yet to identify levers for specific reduction opportunities amongst its value chain partners, or if it has mostly indirect spend and therefore does not spend enough on individual suppliers to support collaborative reduction efforts. Also, supplier engagement targets may drive reduction behaviors that benefit other customers of the same supplier. Engagement targets may be set around any relevant upstream or downstream scope 3 category. Companies can identify which suppliers and customers to include under the target based on spend or emission impact. So engagement targets may alternatively focus on critical suppliers or strategic suppliers, which the company has already identified based on a variety of factors such as operational risk. And spend data and critical supplier lists are advantageous when they can reliably serve as a proxy for leverage over suppliers. However, the biggest suppliers by spend are not always the biggest emitters, so companies should make sure that together with any additional scope 3 targets, the engagement target covers at least 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions. That's a lot of words, but it's easier if I give you examples. So here are 2 examples of how companies set their scope 3 targets. Hewlett-Packard, or HP, and McDonald's are both CDP supply chain members and request their suppliers to disclose emissions data via CDP each year in order to help them report progress towards their targets. HP has used the supplier engagement target method of reducing emissions from purchased goods and services by 15%, counting from a base year of 2015 by targeted year of 2025. They also committed to have their manufacturing suppliers covering 80% of their spend to set SDTs by 2050. So if you're a supplier that falls within the 80% spend, you will be requested by HP to set your own science-based targets. As for McDonald's, they have set an intensity target of 31% emissions reduction per ton of packaging across the chain by 2030. So if you are a manufacturer that produces packaging products for McDonald's, you will be also asked to report on your emissions so that they can, calculate this against their own Scope 3 targets. So apart from HP and McDonald's, more than 40 out of 150 plus CDP supply chain members have set science-based targets. And together they engage more than 13,000 suppliers globally. So if your customer is a CDP supply chain member, you may receive a request to disclose your environmental data. If you haven't already been requested, maybe in next year. So how to get started? For non-SME companies, means most big companies, the first step, which is voluntary, is to sign a public commitment letter that they are developing targets within our criteria and to get them approved and published on the website within 2 years. The target the target development process can look very different depending on which company and which sector. But there's a lot of support options available to you. And the SBTi also provides extensive guidance and resources to support your company along your individual target setting journey. CDP also has a number of accredited solutions providers that can help companies in their preparation of the target setting. And once a company has their targets ready, they can submit them to the SBTi for validation, where they'll be assessed whether they are in line with our criteria. So if you are, you will receive an official approval, and you have a maximum of 6 months to make your targets public. However, if you're an SME, as of July this year, the SBTi created a fast-track route for SMEs that skips the first 3 steps, and I will go into more detail in my next couple of slides. So, SBTi introduced this expedited option for SMEs because smaller companies often lack these resources and capabilities needed to set Scope 3 targets and monitor progress against them. The SBTi's speedy and simplified version for SBT balances the need for them to take account of emissions across their value chains without imposing too great a burden on them. This route enables SMEs to bypass the initial step of committing to set a science-based target and the regular validation process, and to immediately set a science-based target for your Scope 1 and 2 emissions by choosing one of the several predefined target options. And for the purpose of target validation by SBTi, what we consider an SME is defined as a non-subsidiary independent company with fewer than 500 employees. And this SME definition does not include financial institutions and oil and gas companies. So to join the SBTi as an SME, you just need to sign the letter for SMEs by providing your company information, choosing one of the target options, either well below 2 degrees or 1.5 align option. Fill out your company details and review the terms and conditions in the letter before you sign it. And then once you have, you send a digital copy of the letter in PDF to targets@sciencebasedtargets.org. And there is an application fee of $1,000, which waiver can be applied for companies in developing countries or emerging economies, which includes the entire Southeast Asia region, that includes Malaysia. And like larger companies using our standard target validation route, SMEs are required to complete a recent and comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions inventory following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate accounting and reporting standard and guidance. They are also required to publicly report their company-wide Scope 1 and 2 emissions inventory and progress against your published targets on an annual basis. SMEs do not need to set a Scope 3 target, but you must commit to measure and reduce your Scope 3 emissions. And the SBTi also encourages SMEs to set a science-based target by 2030 in line with the 1.5 ambition, which is a higher ambition between the 2 options in the target setting letter. The 1.5 commitment letter explains that if a company sets a long-term net zero target and also an interim science-based target in line with well below 2 degrees Celsius, more aggressive emissions reductions will need to happen in the longer term for the company to meet its net zero commitment. So if you have any questions, please get in touch with us or visit sciencebasedtargets.org. if you're interested to know more about this. There is also a webinar series that we recently hosted on Science Based Targets YouTube channel that you can go to if you're interested to watch them as well. So right now, we have some time for questions, and we will look at some of these questions that were sent earlier. Let me just check. So to complement the carbon, water, and forestry questionnaire, will CDP be preparing a waste management questionnaire in the future? So the short answer is no. We don't have a questionnaire specifically for waste management, but we have integrated questions about waste management in our questionnaires. For example, we ask for emissions related to waste management for landfill, for recycling, and also water impacts in our water questionnaire related to waste management. Joe, do you want to join me in the screen so that the audience can see both of us? So we're in the same room, so yeah. Okay, and then another one is...
So the next question might be, if I can jump in, how do you measure the savings from CO2 and CO2 equivalents, and what are the indicators that need to be measured? So I think the best response to that is that, so in that case, so where do those numbers come from? What happens is the supply chain members who request the information from their vendors, they disclose that information in the climate change questionnaire. So they can list, there's a section on risks and opportunities, and they can list the financial and other impacts of their the steps that they've taken to seize those opportunities for reduction. So that's where you'll find that. The numbers that we shared were from 2019. We'll have updated numbers in our 2020 supply chain report, and that should be available early next year, probably late January or early February. So do look out for that for an update.
Yep. Let's see. Please outline the nature of engagement between ESG indexes and CDP. So CDP, we focus more on the E part of ESG. So if you will notice that our questionnaires are focused on climate change, water, and deforestation. But a lot of ESG data providers, they also use CDP data for the environmental part of their index and how they rank companies as well. Anything to add, Joe?
Yeah, so they're used by, just to give a few examples, so in the capital markets, they're used by FTSE Russell, SP True Cost, MSCI, they show up on Bloomberg terminals. So, and one of the reasons for this is, as we mentioned, our questionnaire is very closely aligned to the TCFD recommendations, and as the TCFD is increasingly being used as a gold standard in terms of climate reporting, we find that more and more data providers, rating agencies, banks preparing sustainability-linked loans, for example, do end up using our data. So yeah, so it's quite diffused, I guess you would say, around the capital markets.
Yep. Let's see. What are the questions? Yep. Okay. Great. Thank you so much for having us on the program, and thank you so much to the team at GCMY for being a great partner of CDP. We look forward to any questions that you want to send to us. You can reach us at our email. If you have any questions for me in particular, you can email the Hong Kong and Southeast Asia mailbox, and we will direct you to the right person within CDP. So in CDP Hong Kong, we have the corporate engagement team, but we have our technical experts that are based in North America and as well as Europe. Yep. Anything else to add?
No, that's all. Thank you so much. And
thank you so much.
Looking forward to connecting soon. Have a great day.